Hey there, I wanted to answer your question about why is subtracting a negative the same thing as distributing a -1. So let's look at a couple of questions that I have on this whiteboard. The first one being 5 minus 7. We know from solving 5 minus 7 in our first unit, that is the same thing as 5 plus a -7, right? When we are subtracting, the whole concept of keep, change this to addition, and change the 7 to its opposite is because we are changing subtraction to add the inverse. So we're adding the inverse to 5. So by subtracting 7, we've added a -7. These are the same thing, subtracting 7 and adding the inverse of 7. So when we look at that with now expressions and variables included, we have 5 minus 7n as an example. Well, 5 minus 7n is also the same thing as 5 plus -7n, okay? So 5 plus -7n would give us the exact same thing. So now let's say instead of subtracting one term, we're subtracting an entire expression, okay? So when we're subtracting an entire expression, we're still adding the inverse of this expression, okay? So when we're adding the inverse, we can look at this as 5 plus the inverse of this entire expression. The inverse would be -7n and -2. So 5 plus -7n minus 2 is the same thing as this expression. I'm going to erase these for a second. Okay, so let's think about what would happen if now we think about this as distributing a -1. Okay, if we multiply -1 times any value, we get its opposite. So for example, 5 times a -1 becomes -5, its opposite. If we have -2n times -1, we would get its opposite, +2n. So multiplying by -1 creates the opposite, or the inverse. So if we think of this as distributing a -1, if we multiply that -1 times everything inside of parentheses, we now have 5 minus 7n minus 2, which matches the whole concept of adding the inverse, okay? So let's look at a couple of other examples. Let's look at if I had 5 minus, I'm going to use the same terms, but this time I have -7n plus 2, okay? So 5 minus -7n plus 2. If we think about subtraction as becoming adding the inverse, we have 5 plus, now we need the inverse of this entire term. The inverse of the entire term would be +7n and minus 2. If we look at this as distributing a -1, we should get the same exact thing. 5, a -1 times a -7n becomes +7n, and -1 times +2 becomes -2. So these match. Okay, so whether we are adding the inverse or we are thinking of this as distributing a -1 being multiplied does create the inverse of both terms. I hope that was helpful.